Hello, welcome everyone to the digital press conference in response to the 36th ASEAN Summit 2020, protecting human rights in and democracy during the COVID-19 pandemic. This event is co-organized by Forum Asia, ASEAN Parliamentarian for Human Rights, Center for Strategic and International Studies, ASEAN SOGIE Caucus, and Human Rights Watch. And it is also a part of the ASEAN Community Virtual Summit 2020. My name is Hanung from Forum Asia. I'll be your moderator for today. So before we jump into the conversations, there are several house rules that I would like to reiterate to everybody. So the first ones, just to let you know that this event is broadcasted through Facebook and YouTube. So you might be keep in mind on the confidentiality of information that you would like to share here. And then also during the course of 1 hour, we encourage participants to actively engage through the Q&A chat box. So if you would like to have questions, please use the Q&A feature in this Zoom by clearly stating your name and then your questions and then to whom you want the questions to be directed to. Otherwise, we will just take it as a general questions. Due to the limited amount of time that we have, we are not able to accommodate intervention through audio. So please maximize the participations through the Q&A feature um, in the Zooms. And also from time to time, we also be imported questions. We are going to import questions from YouTube and Facebook that will be put in the Q&A feature here. And thanks to the help of the technical teams of Forum Asia for this. And then we also encourage speakers to directly answer the questions through the Q&A feature in writing, or just indicate whether you want to answer the questions later during the Q&A lively. And then please keep in mind that for those who are not speaking, please mute your microphone so that we have better audio connectivity for that. Okay, let's jump to the main agenda, because as we know that the ASEAN leaders are convening the summit today to discuss specific issues on COVID-19 and other matters. But one key important message or questions that we have now is how the human rights has been sidelined from the discourse and the discussions on ASEAN. So today we are very much humbled to have 4 distinguished speakers to speak about the human rights situations related to the pandemic in ASEAN. So allow me to introduce the speakers for today. The first one is Ms. Rachel Arinii Judhistari. She's the program manager of the East Asia and ASEAN program of Forum Asia. And then the second to speak is Ms. Lini Zurlia. Lini, if you can put your video so that people can see you. Ms. Lini Zurlia is the advocacy officer from the ASEAN SOGIE Caucus, an LGBTIQ network organizations based in the Philippines. And then the third one is Mr. Phil Robertson, the Deputy Director for Asia Division of Human Rights Watch. And last but not least, we are very much humbled to have the Honorable Mr. Charles Santiago, the Member of Parliament from Malaysia, and also Chairperson of the ASEAN Parliamentarian for Human Rights. So just keep in mind all on the time that its speakers have 7 minutes to provide the interventions before going to the Q&A sessions. So without further ado, Rachel, I would like to give the time and space to you to give an overall overview of the human rights situations and COVID-19 pandemic from the Forum Asia's perspective.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hanung. May I kindly request help for my presentations to be showcased? May I ask help from Cindy or Hanung to showcase my presentations? That would be really good. Thank you. Thank you so much. My name is Rachel Arinii. I'm the East Asian ASEAN Program Manager of Forum Asia. We are a regional human rights organization that has been operating since 1991. And now we have more than 82 members across 21 countries in the region. So as Hanung mentioned, I actually want to share with you on the situation we are at. We are currently in a human rights crisis in ASEAN in regards to COVID-19 pandemic, and there are some findings that we would like to share with the media friends. Next, please. So at this point, as everyone knows, there are more than 134,000 cases in ASEAN, with more than almost 4,000 deaths in the region. However, the number are actually beyond what has been reported as per the ASEAN Secretary General estimated in one of his op-ed. Next. And we are still looking at possible increase of this number. Next, and in alignment with that, Forum Asia, together with SHAPE-C and Solidarity Action of People Advocacy in Asia, host a rapid assessment on civil society organizations. So we got information from all of the Southeast Asian countries, from academia, media, international organization, local national organization, even grassroots organizations. Next. We asked the people in ASEAN whether ASEAN have facilitated meaningful participation of CSOs during the pandemic, and starking 80% say that they disagree with the statement, which is very evident because when we see the ASEAN Summit 36 session that's happening now, there are no CSOs interface between the ASEAN leaders with the communities. We understand that ASEAN did interface with the ASEAN Interparliamentary Association Assembly as well as the youth, but there is no interface or any meaningful engagement of CSOs in the current ASEAN Summit. Next. And some of the respondents even shared that they don't see any engagement at all, which is very troubling looking at ASEAN's people center principle as one of the key value of ASEAN that has been agreed in 2015. So we definitely see disregard of the ASEAN people center principles within the current ASEAN Summit. Next. And then when we asked the respondent on what do they think about the human rights mechanism of ASEAN, 75% of the respondents share that ASEAN human rights mechanism have not ensured the adoption and implementation of human rights-based approach in the ASEAN pandemic responses. We will go more detail on how the ASEAN member states have not respect the human rights principles in addressing the pandemic, and in fact imposing more repressive laws that impacting civic space in the next slide. Next. And we also understand that, yes, this one. So we, yes, this one, no, before that. Next, please. So some of the respondents say that it's true that AICHR has released statement. This is their first thematic statement that they released after 10 years. However, there is no follow-up mechanism on whether the government will follow what AICHR have requested in the statement itself. And then secondly, other mechanisms such as the Commission on Women and Children have not made any move or even a single statement to address the current condition, which greatly affecting women and children in the region. Next, please. We also asked the respondent whether they think that ASEAN leaders have successfully protected their rights. And of course, like 81% of the respondents disagree with this. So definitely people perceive the ASEAN leaders of not being able to protect their right, which is very detrimental. Next. And then even some of the respondents share that the ASEAN non-interference principle, it is inhibiting ASEAN timely responses to the current pandemic, which is very troubling because we always see how the ASEAN leaders using these principles as a means to stall any discussions on key human rights issues in the region. Next. We also ask what are the rights that are deteriorating during the pandemic in ASEAN. Next, please. And then we found that there are 5 rights that are extremely deteriorating during the current pandemic. One is the freedom of expressions. The respondents shared that more than 85% of them are sharing that the freedom of deteriorating and of closing down of ABS-CBN media outlets in Philippines has greatly affected the rights of freedom of expressions in the region. And then throughout the span of the pandemic, we also see how fake news law are being utilized by the government to criminalize dissent. Even more than 700 people in Vietnam have received a kind of fine as well as arrest due to their comments on Facebook about the COVID-19 situations. And in Malaysia, more than 20,000 people have violated the movement control order, and that includes also just simple comments on how the situations is in the country. And then we also see that 80% of the respondents perceive that freedom of association are deteriorating. Again, in Philippines, there are communities that doing an assembly to demand their access to food, and surely they got arrest and fine. However, there are also governments who do like a concert and like big gatherings without getting any precautions. Without getting any consequences for doing that given the public health hazard. Next, please. And then we also see how, next, please. And then almost 90, before that, one slide before that. More than 90% of the respondents also shared that the human rights defender situations are deteriorating. Why? Because we see that most of the ASEAN governments have imposed new laws that permit surveillance with the use of apps, the tracking movement. We see the Peduli Lindungi apps in Indonesia, as well as application that being used in Thailand and Singapore. And given the lax of our data privacy policy in the region, we see this as a means to increase surveillance that surpass the principle of proportionality and necessity during the COVID-19 periods, because there is no protection of confidentiality as well as data privacy during the utilization of the apps. And then we also see how migrant and refugees issues are extremely deteriorating, like almost 80% of the respondents said so, because since the pandemic has been hitting ASEAN, we documented how countries in ASEAN actively refusing the refugees, especially Rohingya refugees, to enter their country to seek for food and basic needs. And this is happening in Malaysia on April, when police said that the refugees cannot enter Malaysia due to the COVID-19. And then recently, like yesterday, yesterday actually, 100 more of women and children's refugees of Rohingya are trying to enter Aceh, Indonesia, and despite of our strong, like Indonesia's strong commitment on refugee and Rohingya issues in the UN as well as ASEAN level, but the destiny of these 100 Rohingya refugees in Aceh are still remain mystery until now. And then,
sorry, Rachel, you have 1 more minute.
yes, I'm about to finish. Next. And the rights is also deteriorating our indigenous people's right, because more than 89%, 87% of the respondents say that the indigenous people's rights are severely deteriorating, but we have not, we need to do like more research on this matter, because currently there are very limited news coverage on these issues. Next. So aside from the survey, we also do documentations of news from March until now. And then other than the violation of freedom of expression, assembly associations, as well as surveillance that I have mentioned earlier, one trend that currently hitting ASEAN very hard is the securitization and stretching civic space, because 4 countries in ASEAN impose emergency decrees and laws that effectively giving the government with more power to utilize militaristic and police forces in addressing the conditions, while we actually need a public health approach in addressing the pandemic. We all know that from the previous HIV/AIDS pandemic, militarization and criminalization is not the best tools to halting the fierce infections. So next. And in alignment with that, this is some of the laws that has been utilized by the ASEAN government to address the pandemic, and you can see how majority of the ASEAN government are using the emergency state laws. Next again, please. So let's go to the and this is the comparative responses with other human rights mechanism. We see how ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights only issue one statement compared to how the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights issues 25 statements. Next. And in terms of the issues that being covered by that statement, our ASEAN mechanism have not yet include the issues of freedom of assembly, association, as well as LGBTIQ rights. Next, please. And the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights created a rapid response task force, which allow more than 100 complaints on human rights violation during the pandemic documented. And this creates guidelines for the inter-American governments to act on this. This kind of modality are missing in the regions, and yet we have not seen any strong response from the ASEAN human rights mechanism on this matter. Next. And in terms of the recommendation, I just want to highlight 2 key recommendations which align with the ASEAN summit right now. The ASEAN leaders are currently discussing about the post-pandemic recovery plan, as well as the values of coherence. So would be really, one of the key recommendations that we need to voice to them is the necessity of including civil society organizations to ensure that human rights principles are being central to the post-pandemic response recovery plans. And then it is also very important to ensure that all the repressive laws that being created after the pandemic can be reviewed, because we definitely know that those repressive laws are creating a human rights crisis in the region. So that's from me. Thank you so much, Hanung. Sorry about the time.
Yep. Thank you very much, Rachel, for giving such a elaborative explanations on what happened in ASEAN. So just to reiterate my message in this beginning, if you have questions, just directed to the Q&A box in the Zoom feature, and then please do not forget to mention your name, affiliations, especially if you're from the media, so that we can know which media you come from, and then the panelists will answer in the Q&A sessions or directly through written. So without further ado, I will give the place now to Lini Zurlia from ASEAN SOGIE Caucus to give your views on these absence of human rights in the ASEAN during the COVID-19 pandemic and its impacts to the vulnerable groups.
Thank you, Hanung. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lini Zurlia. I am the Advocacy Officer of ASEAN SOGIE Caucus. ASEAN SOGIE Caucus is a network of human rights activists in Southeast Asia. We work for the inclusion of sexual orientation and gender identity and sex characteristic in the mandate of human rights duty barrier in the ASEAN region. We also work for the promotion of the protection of the people of the human rights of LGBTIQ person in Southeast Asia. We established in 2012. We are based in Manila, Philippines. So in the impact of COVID-19, ASEAN SOGIE Caucus did rapid assessment in the early of March to April last few months, involving our members and partners in Southeast Asia region. And then during the rapid assessment, we found that many LGBTIQ folks work in informal economic sector lost their job. They work in salon, they work in wedding organizer, event organizer. So most of the queer folks are lost their job due to this economic sector, economic informal sector. Some of them struggle in access the support mechanism. They also need LGBTIQ youth who still live with their parents. They need to dealing with their abusive homophobic parents, unable to access the COVID relief provided by the government due to the identity card, since every government officials required identity card to access the relief. And then in the case of Indonesia, for example, many of transgender folks, they don't have identity card to access the relief. And then queers who living with HIV had concern in accessing ARV, and then transgender also expressed concern over access to hormone therapies during the pandemic. But not only that, in Thailand, for example, communities where indigenous stateless person live under lockdown, as Rachel already mentioned, that some of the ASEAN countries restricted and use the militarization approach. So the group in the military border also affected by this. And then in Singapore, a survey conducted among LGBTIQ youth found that 1 in 5 LGBTQ person live in family environments that are hostile toward their sexual orientation and gender identity. And then in Myanmar, our network called Rainbow Alliance in Myanmar conducted a survey during the pandemic involving youth aged 19 to 25 years old. And then all of them working prior to the pandemic, but then the survey found that 50% of them lost their job due to pandemic, again because they work in informal sector. And then this morning, I need to also to mention that this morning just happened in Manila. a group of protesters from a different LGBTIQ organization held a peaceful protest to raise concern over the militarization's approach of Duterte to address COVID, and then the serious of neglect of the government. Also, they against the anti-terror law. There is no law that prohibits public assembly because it's already expired due to lifted quarantine, but then 20 of the organizers are now being arrested. I would also love to mention that the only government in the local level is that mention and address LGBTIQ issues during the pandemic is in the Philippines, not in the national government, but more in local government, such as in Pasig City, Iloilo City, Quezon City. They impose respond through the social amelioration program that also include women, children, and LGBTIQ folks. Other than these three local government in the ASEAN region, there is no more country or government who specific addressing LGBTIQ group in dealing with the pandemic. So then as an organization, we will always remind, even though that our rights have not been recognized yet in this region, but still we demand ASEAN member state to protect the rights of the LGBTIQ people, protects the rights of its people, and provide appropriate assistance to the most vulnerable group during pandemic and post-pandemic, including LGBTIQ person. As Rachel has already mentioned, that militarization approach is, will not answer, will not fix the problem, rather will create more problem in the region. So we demand the ASEAN state member, as they conducting, as they convene today in their summit, to use a human rights approach in dealing with the pandemic. I think that's all. Hanung, if there's any more question or clarification, we can have it later on.
Thank you very much, Lee, for very brief and effective information on how the measures made by the ASEAN actually, well, we see that it might be okay for majority, but it can exacerbating the impact of the human rights violations to LGBTIQ groups and other vulnerable groups in the regions. And please, if you have questions to Lini, to Rachel, and to other speakers, just put it in the Q&A so that we will address it later. Then I'm going to give the time to Phil Robertson from the Human Rights Watch to give his views on the assessment related to ASEAN, and particularly maybe a little bit about the chairship of Vietnam related to ASEAN, because this is particularly interesting topics they haven't been mentioned with by Lini and Rachel before. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Actually, it's very interesting that the chairmanship of Vietnam, I remember we were all debating last year about whether we were even going to be able to hold an ASEAN Peoples Forum event in Vietnam. And now it looks like we don't have to, because everything's online and because of the COVID-19 crisis. Thank you. I'm Phil Robertson. I'm the Deputy Asia Director for Human Rights Watch, and I want to thank the organizers of this press conference, especially Rachel and the team at Forum Asia, who have done a great job organizing all these important efforts around the virtual ASEAN Summit. It's a pleasure to be here, be part of such an important panel with distinguished participants. Even on the best of days, I would say, when these meetings in ASEAN happen face-to-face, it's hard to get ASEAN to take civil society seriously and to listen to our views. And now that we're in the world of virtual meetings prompted by COVID-19, it's even more difficult. So Forum Asia and its partners, including all the people on this press conference, have shown some really remarkable dedication and perseverance in trying to get the message across to ASEAN governments that, and it's a message they don't want to hear, that they must protect human rights. They must move towards truly rights-respecting participatory democracy, where ordinary people can play a role in their own political, economic, and social futures. And as we look at what has happened with the COVID-19 crisis, we can see that the COVID-19 pandemic has created serious challenges for the people of ASEAN, a number of multiple crises. First of all, of course, there's a public health crisis with the deadly disease spreading quickly in many countries that has revealed very serious limitations on many nations' hospitals and health services. And the right to quality health care is a human right. We've seen, Singapore, Indonesia, and Malaysia hit hard by the COVID-19 crisis. But it's interesting, other countries so far are unbelievably lucky. The country where I'm sitting in, Thailand, but also Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia. Vietnam has been repressive from day one, but ultimately they're controlling it as well. But there's a public health crisis. People are very, very seriously concerned, and we see how the health systems really are not up to snuff in many cases. There's been an economic crisis. This is one where we've seen many people thrown out of work with no clear timeline or prospects for return to a previous normal. And there's been a very serious revealing of the limitations of many countries' social safety nets. People have a right to these economic, social, and cultural rights, livelihoods, quality education, quality health, and the economic crisis is endangering all that. There's also been what I would call a vulnerability crisis, that those who are least prepared to respond to the crisis, such as daily wage workers, informal sector workers, foreign migrant workers, these people find that they can't even afford their housing, daily necessities, and food. There are diplomats in Bangkok who are going out organizing food drives for migrant workers who are stranded from Myanmar and from Cambodia and Laos, who can't afford to go back to their own countries and can't afford to buy food to eat. Lini and the ASEAN SOGIE Caucus have done a very good job of talking about also the vulnerability of LGBTQI people during this crisis, and it's a very serious problem. We're also seeing a workers' crisis, as employers who are temporarily shuttering their operations are targeting trade unionists first to try to get rid of organized workers and organized worker representatives. And we're seeing this in the garment sector and other sectors in Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Malaysia, Indonesia. They're using a pandemic to try to destroy workers' movements and workers' power. There's a democracy crisis, as laws and public participation are suspended, and there's a lack of accountability among local, provincial, national officials, as well as police and military for abuses, because everything's happening under a public health crisis. These things are being pushed under the rug. And of course, there's a human rights crisis, as governments crack down on basic civil and political rights like freedom of expression, freedom of peaceful public participation, and freedom of association, because they fear backlash. They fear that if they allow protests or they allow people to say what they feel, because of the economic downturn, people are going to get angry at the governments. And or in some cases, they're demanding compliance with public health measures like quarantine's the only way they know how, which is using power, using restrictions to try to force people to comply. Now, it's true that international human rights law recognizes that in the context of serious public health emergency, there are restrictions on some rights, and these can be justified, but only when those measures are strictly necessary, legal, based on scientific evidence, and limited in scope and duration, and proportionate to address the crisis. And finally, also neither arbitrary nor discriminatory in application. And the reality is that the ASEAN states aren't even coming close to that standard in most cases. In these cases, instead of promoting a more principled approach, we've seen ASEAN as an organization has essentially been bound and gagged over in the corner, irrelevant to the discussion, constrained by its unwillingness to contravene the so-called non-interference rule in internal affairs of its members. And so, ASEAN's talking about these things, but, is anybody really paying any attention to what ASEAN has to say about the COVID-19 crisis? Because they've brought nothing to the table. They've really contributed nothing that is meaningful. So to get in a little more detail, and I know my time is limited, we're seeing states using the COVID-19 crisis to pass more repressive laws. And of course, Prime Minister Hun Sen in Cambodia is the standout example here with his new state of emergency law that reminds me of some of the things we've seen from North Korea. Both Thailand's used the crisis to dust off their 2005 emergency decree and use that to prosecute political activists for trying to hold events to raise concerns about other issues. We're seeing fake news prosecutions in Thailand. We're also seeing fake news prosecutions in the Philippines. The Philippines passed the new Banihan to Heal as One Act, which was to give more powers to Duterte. And that was used in part to criminalize fake news. And we've seen some fake news prosecutions. We're also very concerned, of course, that in the middle of this crisis, Duterte has used his authority to pass an anti-terror act, which I think is going to be very problematic. Myanmar is considering new public health legislation that may be problematic. And they've seen a broad suspension of civil and political rights across the board, again, about freedom of association, expression, peaceful public assembly. In Cambodia, we've seen the use of these fake news laws against particularly opposition political members, people who are activists in the Cambodia National Rescue Party who are still in Cambodia. And of the 32 political prisoners that are currently in Cambodian prisons that we've counted, half of them have been detained since January. We're also seeing governments, imposing movement control orders where they sort of assert authority rather than exercise common sense. The entire reason for having emergency control orders was to enforce social distancing, not to put people at greater risk through detention and imprisonment for violating the MCO. If you want to fine somebody, that's one thing. But what we've seen in the places like the Philippines, we've seen abuses of people, including LGBT people and others, when they're arrested at the barangay level, being abused, being detained, being humiliated. In Myanmar, over 500 people, including children, have been sentenced to prison. When you send someone to prison, you're putting them in a cramped space where they're more likely to get COVID-19 rather than allowing them to remain in their communities.
Sorry, Phil, you have 1 more minute. Thank you.
Malaysia has some of the same issues. I mean, we had the very famous case that people got really angry about, where you had a woman who took a birthday cake to her boyfriend, who was in prison for a week and fined for violating a movement control order. I mean, she was taking a birthday cake to her boyfriend. Vietnam has been issuing arrest warrants. Another problem that we're seeing is increased xenophobia. I think there's a longer conversation to have about these Rohingya boat people and the boats that have faced ping pong pushbacks between Thailand and Malaysia. And we just had another boat land in Indonesia now. But there was also a hate speech campaign launched against the Rohingya in Malaysia. And the May 1st roundup, which has really created a feeling that, the foreigners in Malaysia are not welcome and that these people are bringing disease. Singapore, they didn't even consider migrant worker dormitories as part of their COVID-19 plan. The WHO representative was supposedly shocked that it had been left out. And it was entirely predictable that there would be problems because mainstream journalists in the Straits Times and others have been talking about the failures of providing sanitary, proper housing for migrant workers in Singapore for years. I mean, these have been written about. People need to ask what happened to all the migrant worker levy money, the between 400 to 900 Singapore dollars per month that is being taken from the worker salary and being given to the government. Where did they put that money? That's the sort of question that people should be asking the ruling PAP now that they're heading to election on July 10th. How did you fail so badly to not protect migrant workers when you made your plans for the COVID-19? we've seen an outbreak of COVID-19 in Malaysia immigration detention centers. We've seen it in Thai detention centers. So again, vulnerable people, migrant workers, are being blamed and also being treated more abusively. Other issues which we can talk about during the question and answer, there's whole issues of privacy, of digital security and privacy. When people are saying you need to put this app on your mobile phone in order to check in or check out of a store, or in order to allow for tracing, what guarantees are people getting from governments that that won't be used in an abusive way in the future? And in some cases, I mean, it's important also to recognize that in some places, information is being kept from people. We see in Myanmar, it has the longest internet shutdown in the world in Rakhine State. And this is something that people were talking about last week, because this is the anniversary of the 1-year mark for that shutdown. And the government of Myanmar has just said they're going to continue it beyond August 1st. So again, you see the use of information to track people, to surveil people, or in fact, to keep people out of the information flow on the internet. This is problematic as well.
Phil, your time is actually up, so if you can wrap up quickly, thank you.
Yeah, and finally, I would add that this whole crisis has once again put a real spotlight on the deprivation of basic standards for prisoners across the region. When you look at what the Philippines prisons look like, or Cambodia's prisons look like, and when you consider the COVID-19 epidemic and the danger it poses for the kind of crowding we see in those facilities, and the failure of governments to really release significant number of people, despite the massive humanitarian concern and the public health concern, once again shows that these governments abuse human rights sort of almost as a knee-jerk reaction, and that much more pressure needs to be placed on these governments to improve their human rights compliance. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Phil, for the presentations. So without further ado, I will give the time and space for Honorable Mr. Charles Santiago to speak on behalf of the Member of Parliament on your view on this. Thank you.
Thanks, Hanung, and fellow speakers. I bring you greetings of peace and solidarity from the ASEAN Parliamentarians for Human Rights. This morning we had our board meeting for 3 long hours. It was a very intense meeting, and my eyes is going to fall apart though. It's going to pop out though. That's the kind of, staring at the computer for 3-4 hours is no joke though. But anyway, greetings from the board to all our speakers and friends of the media as well. I'm just going to talk about 3 sets of issues, and I'll keep it short. First, I want to express my deepest gratitude and a big tabe hormat to our Indonesian fishermen. I think they have sent a great message to the leaders of ASEAN about the notions of compassion, the notion of protecting people in trouble, especially when they are in the sea, and how simple people, ordinary people, vulnerable communities have reached out to the Rohingya refugees who are running away from genocide, from all kinds of violence, whether they are in Bangladesh or whether they are in Rakhine State. So I want to begin by really saluting them. I think they have sent a great message to ASEAN leaders, that requesting essentially to the ASEAN leaders to pay attention to the vulnerable communities that are in part of ASEAN. ASEAN's 36th anniversary's big title or framework is cohesive and responsive ASEAN. That's the big agenda for ASEAN, and clearly there's a vulnerable community of not 10,000 people, of 100 people, especially women and men, fighting for survival in the seas of ASEAN, and we are unable to respond to them. This must be the most shameful act on the part of the ASEAN governments. I'm not sure how else to describe the situation. When there's a pandemic, when there's a crisis, our heart must go out. Our compassion must be the priority. But here we are going to allow people to die, and I think the Indonesian fishermen have really come out, and I think I want to salute them again. And the lesson they have taught ASEAN, the people of ASEAN, as well as the leaders of ASEAN, that people matter, especially when there's a crisis, whether you are on land or whether you are in the sea. And I think this also goes to reflect the fact that ASEAN has not done much on the issue of Rohingyas in Rakhine State. There's been lots of talk, lots of meetings, lots of conferences, but nothing solid has come out in trying to frame the solution to ASEAN. Though ASEAN leaders should not forget that the Rohingyas are part of ASEAN. They are ASEAN citizens. And if we cannot respond to the most vulnerable community, and the UN calls them the most vulnerable community in the world, people have gone through a genocide, people have gone through a crime against humanity. This is the people that we have to address, and I think we have miserably failed. And therefore, I'm not so sure how we can call ourselves a caring society, a responsive society going forward. Though. So I think this is something really wrong with ASEAN in that sense. So I think I want to begin by saluting them, and it is a great lesson for ASEAN coming from the most vulnerable community in the country, or even in Indonesia for the matter, the farming community, or the fishermen community. Though. The second point I would like to raise is the issue of, I think, point that Rachel had already raised, Phil had raised it, Liani has also raised the issue, and this is the deteriorating human rights conditions that we find, and how ASEAN governments, in particular Thailand, Cambodia, and Philippines, have taken advantage of the pandemic to further strengthen their position in the country. I think our speakers have spoken to that, and they have actually got a greater, stronger hold on the country through a variety of means to strengthen the hold of power in their own countries. I think our friends have already said that. In the case of Malaysia, there is completely a lack of parliamentary oversight in the affairs of the country. In fact, we had a session of parliament, and in fact, it was a process that could have been a better conducted. Though. The third point I would like to make is simply that we are in a pandemic, and there is a lot of talk about a medicine, a vaccine, a need for a vaccine. I think this is an important issue because there is a lot of talk that there will be a vaccine that is in the last stages of development and so on and so forth. And all I want to impress upon our friends in the media is that health is a human right, and if I know how, if for experiences from before tells us that if there is a vaccine, the cost of the vaccine is going to be very, very, very expensive. So in the case, like for example, of sofosbuvir. Sofosbuvir is the medicine given for hepatitis C, and you need 80 tablets for complete cure of hepatitis C, and one tablet is worth $1,000 US. So can you imagine now? You need $80,000 US for a complete cure of hepatitis C. Now, and Malaysia, of course, went to the WTO and the government used provision in order to decrease the price from 360,000 to 1,000 ringgit. 1,000 ringgit. So the point I want to make to our ministers for meeting tomorrow is that they must come out very strongly and make an impression to the global community, especially the big pharma, that this medicine or this vaccine that they're coming out with must be affordable, and there must be a governance structure in place to ensure that the vulnerable communities are provided the medicine with, in an affordable fashion, and also for the the poorest of our society, it should be given for free. I think this is important because this virus, it clearly affects the poor and the rich. But unfortunately, social distancing cannot be practiced when you stay in small houses. It's impossible. Workers in Malaysia, migrant workers in Malaysia, share a house, a small house, with 30 people, when sometimes 40 people, and there's no way they can actually practice social distancing. And therefore, people like that in other countries is the same. In shelters, in small homes, in squatters, and so on. Social practice is just an utopian. It's not. It's a leisure. It's a luxury. So therefore, people like that should be given medicine for free. But the point I want to make is that ASEAN governments must make it very clear to the big pharma that they cannot, sell these prices at high prices, sell these medicines for pharmaceuticals for high prices, and it must be made affordable. And I think ASEAN has to play a role in this matter. I think the last point, I just want to echo some of the points that were made earlier, that we are in a pandemic, we are in a crisis. It's a health pandemic, but has led to a huge unemployment across the region. From the most developed country in Singapore right up to Laos and Cambodia, you have employment across the board, across the board. My question to the ASEAN government is, where is that discussion taking place tomorrow? Where is that discussion about the issues of food security in the region? How to resolve job losses in the region? It is not even in the agenda tomorrow. I looked at the plan for tomorrow, the plan for tomorrow, and I didn't see anywhere a discussion on what do you call it, on job creation or even food exchange. If there's a shortage of supply in one country, another country could help in the context of a regional organization. That's what ASEAN should be. But I do not see that happening though. If there's a shortage of medicine in one country, another country ASEAN can help out. There must be that kind of an exchange. Otherwise, to call it a regional body, which is 36 years, or I'm sorry, which much older, but it's 36 years of the ASEAN heads of government meeting, it will mean nothing though. So I don't think ASEAN wants to be remembered as a NATO, no action, talk only. It is time tomorrow that ASEAN governments need to say that they have discussed the issue of unemployment, they have discussed the issue of Rohingyas, they have discussed the issue of food security, and they will work together in order to ensure that the people of ASEAN are protected at this important moment in time. Thank you very much.
Forgot to mute. So thank you very much, Charles, for your presentation and to be here with us today. So before we go to the question and answers, we just would like to reiterate that all of the materials been mentioning by the speakers will be shared with the participants together with the Forum Asia's briefing paper on the ASEAN and COVID-19 and human rights. And also, we are also releasing press releases on today's event. So if you're having difficulties on capturing the highlights of the discussions, hopefully the press releases can help you to give the pictures of what I've been discussing today. So let's go directly to the question and answer sessions. So far we have 5, so we just divided into 2 rounds. So the first one from Hannah Hifni. So the question is, what shall we do to make the existence of ASEAN really felt and benefits ASEAN society to the grassroots level, so that we could promote the human rights values as how it's expected? And then the second one is about the economic rights. How does the ASEAN region face and will emerge from this crisis, specifically facing economic challenges and unemployment and layoffs? And then the third one from, we received it from Facebook, from the fellow from Facebook. Can you please tell what should the government, I think this is the ASEAN government, do for Myanmar? Since there is no indications this question should be directed to specific persons, I think this can be answered in general to whoever wants to answer. The floor is yours.
I'm happy to say I try to answer a few of these, at least to start. Let me respond to the person via Facebook, what the government should do for Myanmar. I mean, critically, the thing that ASEAN could do most critically right now is talk to the Myanmar government and tell them to turn the internet on in Rakhine State. When you talk about certain people in Rakhine State who don't even know there's a COVID-19 pandemic taking place because they're cut off from information in remote areas, that's a fundamental human rights problem. You know, people deserve to have access to information. People deserve to be able to know what is going on. And for a government to turn off the internet and basically leave them in the dark for whatever reason they're doing it, and they're doing it in part, I think, because they are trying to cover up atrocities that are being committed by the Myanmar security forces in Rakhine State against civilians. But you know, they're making it more difficult for people to get COVID-19 information. They're making it more difficult for humanitarians to be able to operate there and provide assistance and help. And ultimately, they're going to make it more difficult for the Rohingya people who are stuck in the refugee camps in Bangladesh to be able to know what the situation is and decide whether they can come back or not. So it's really something that the ASEAN should take up with Myanmar. They should pick a couple key issues that they can take up and really press hard on them, because Myanmar is the outlier here. They have such a horrible human rights record, and this is a human rights record which is now sending boats of Rohingya out into the region. And this is a regional problem now, and ASEAN has every right to try to address that.
Okay, thank you very much, Phil. Other panelists to answer?
Can I also add on that? So I think like all of the fellow panelists have really laid down that we are actually in time of crisis, and in a time of crisis, I don't think this is the right time for us to compete like which rights need to be addressed first and which needs to be neglected. I think this is the best time to really think of intersectionality between the issues, because when access to health or health rights are not available for everyone, including migrants and refugees, we cannot guarantee of their freedom of expression, assembly, association, and vice versa. So I think like the principle of interlinkages among the rights are very important to be highlighted here. And secondly, when we're talking about the trends in ASEAN, looking at how Vietnam chairing the ASEAN mechanism, ASEAN right now, we are going to have a very difficult time ahead, because next year Brunei will be the chair, and then after that Cambodia will be the chair. I don't think ASEAN can manage or keep it relevant unless civil society organizations and people are really included in the process, and unless the ASEAN people are really pushing towards the accountability of the governments in assuring all the human rights of the people, which include economic rights, etc. And as Charles mentioned about the accessibility of vaccine and how patent can influence the pricing of it, we also need to be very mindful that ASEAN is a very dynamic region with the widest inequality gap. So a month ago, the ASEAN economic pillars met and the economic minister agreed to create the post-pandemic recovery plan for the ASEAN economy. And yet the partner that they've chosen is the private sector. So we as the civil society organization will really need to request the ASEAN economic pillars to include everyone in the process of creating this post-pandemic recovery plan, because with the new normal principles, we cannot go back to the old way of governing economic cooperation in ASEAN. As we know, it is really affecting the most marginalized community and are not equal at all. So that's from me. Thank you, Hanung.
Hanung, just to add, Rachel.
Yes, please.
Echoing what Rachel said, that yeah, we cannot go back. We have to remind the ASEAN leaders that we cannot go back to the new normal that they mentioned, especially on the economic approach that they have in the period before the pandemic hit the region. And then someone, anonymous attendee, also mentioned that in the human rights and democracy in this pandemic should discuss the challenges faced by ASEAN and employments and layoff, not LGBTIQ. This is also the mentality of our leaders in ASEAN when they say, when they create economic, when they create economic approach or economic growth development, they always think that this is only for economic and this is not for this is not for this group. So the approach of not for certain people or not for certain group in the ASEAN, in fact, these certain people are actually ASEAN people who live in ASEAN, people who have who hold the ASEAN citizen. They should be protected. They should be the rights of the people should be protected. So just to echo what Rachel mentioned, we cannot go back to that new normal. Thanks, Hanung.
To try to answer about the question related to the grassroots level, what we can do to make the existence of ASEAN.
Hanung, can
And
I
perhaps Salas
jump in?
also. Yes, please.
Okay. This goes back, I think it tries to answer both the questions that you had raised, the first two questions that you had raised. I think ASEAN has to go back to its own declarations. In fact, there is the ASEAN Declaration on Strengthening Social Protection. And this has been signed on to for some years and has gone through a review process as well. So that means there is a social protection mechanism available in ASEAN. I think it'll be great if we can activate that social protection declaration at this time, given the pandemic linked job losses, food security, basic services like healthcare and so on and so forth, that is becoming increasingly challenging for most people. So I think one of the things that we should push for a decision tomorrow involving our heads of government meeting is that they should go back and visit the document, and based on the document to come out with a response going forward in terms of basic services, food, security for people across the region, and social protection. And I think all these three issues, if you read the declaration, it is very much premised on the notion of human rights, and also you can extend it also to the Sustainable Development Goals argument that some people put forward. So I think there is a declaration. Governments have signed on to it, and I think now is the time for the government to wake up and realize that they have signed a document called the ASEAN Declaration on Social Protection. I think a further point is that the ASEAN Charter itself gives ASEAN governments the role to protect and promote human rights. It's clearly stated in the Charter that human rights is one important component. Although most of our governments will skip that particular sentence, but we have to keep reminding them that that is an important sentence that actually influences every other discussion that we should have. Maybe that's one of our roles as civil society. So I think it's all there. It's all there, let me assure you. But the question is, do our leaders have the political will at the regional level, or any of the one of that, or two or three or four leaders of the region have the political will to push it tomorrow and to ask for some answers to the questions that we are raising. So I think, given that Vietnam is the host, I think maybe Vietnam should be given the responsibility as the people of ASEAN, in order for the government of Vietnam to take up some of these issues involving the declaration on social protection, the food supply, ensuring food security in the region, as well as access to healthcare, education, and so on and so forth, especially at this time. So I think we should really push our governments very hard on this issue.
Can I say something about Vietnam? Since
Yes.
there was a question from the anonymous attendee. And they were talking about the fact that Vietnam's COVID-19 response has been fairly impressive. I think that, from a public health perspective, you're going to say that, yes, I mean, Vietnam has done quite a good job in dealing with the COVID-19 spread. The problem with Vietnam is that at the same time that they've been dealing with COVID-19, they've also redoubled their crackdown on activists and dissidents. Vietnam never misses an opportunity to go after its own people who are demanding respect for rights, who are trying to call out the government for land seizures. You know, we're about to see the prosecution of the people at the Dong Tam case. We had 6 people arrested yesterday, you know, using Article 117 of the Penal Code, which is propaganda against the state. You know, there's these national security crimes that Vietnam has on the books that it uses in a very, very systematic and pervasive way to try to crack down on any sort of people who are questioning the government's priorities or the way that it operates. And the problem, frankly, in Vietnam is that not the COVID-19 response, but the accompanying response, which is using this opportunity when other countries around the world in Europe, North America, and elsewhere are distracted by COVID-19 to redouble their efforts to try to crack down on their own critics.
Okay, thank you very much, Phil. Okay, we have 2 more questions that we can answer due to the limitation of time. The first one is, how can ASEAN economic community be humanized, since ASEAN also made people-centered and rule of law as basis for economic integrations? That's one. And then the second one, I think, directed to Mr. Charles Santiago, what should ASEAN government do for facilitating return of Rohingyas to their home in Rakhine? So maybe Charles first, because there's one questions specifically directed to you. Please unmute your microphone.
Okay, sorry, go ahead. Can you give, what's the first question again?
The first question is, how can ASEAN economic community be humanized, since ASEAN also made people-oriented and rule of law as basis for economic integrations? And then the second question is directed specifically to you. What should ASEAN government do for facilitating return of Rohingyas to their home in Rakhine? That's from Shahidul Islam Koduri from Bangladesh.
Okay, how do you humanize an economic project? That's the question you're asking me. I think we go back to ASEAN's purpose of existence, though. And I think it's fair to say that ASEAN talks about a caring and a sharing society. It talks about distribution, it talks about social protection, it talks about the rule of law, governance, and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, the focus is not so much on rule of law, governance, or even human rights, but the focus is actually on business and investments. You can see that from the Vientiane Plan of Action to the various other trade agreements that the region is signing, and the business lobby that ASEAN promotes from time to time. I think we must be careful that we support economic activities, we support investment in the region, we support business in the region, which is very good, and we should all welcome it. But I think as a region, we should go one forward to say, yes, business is good, but there must be distribution that is equitable across the board. That is when you begin to humanize the economy. When everybody can benefit, everybody can share the benefits of business and investments in the region. But clearly, if you look at the numbers that are coming out, the numbers actually point out that there is a massive concentration of wealth in all of our countries, and more people are falling through the cracks, and therefore in poverty and so on and so forth. So really, the question is, I'm not sure how you humanize an economic structure or a human economic way of thinking. But I think what we could do is begin to think about our economy a bit differently. Maybe we should talk about a solidarity economy, for example, an economy where everybody can benefit, where it's an equitable distribution of wealth, where the most vulnerable communities are protected, whether they are farmers in Philippines or fishermen in Cambodia or fishermen in Indonesia, for example. I think this is a way to approach, which means that we have to think a bit differently, and ideologically we need to shift from a neoliberal order to one that is much more kinder to people, compassionate to people, and also build solidarity among people. And also, I think that this is a good time to float the idea that the biggest, besides workers who are losing jobs, small and medium industries in the region are being wiped out and will be continuously be wiped out. And their job will be taken over by bigger organizations, more stronger organizations who have lots of money, lots of power. They will take away these jobs. And I think this is where ASEAN governments also can play a role to ensure that small and medium industries also thrive in this environment. So basically, I think we need to move away from a profit-centered economy, a whole 100% profit economy, to something more distributive, where everybody can have access to the wealth of the country and the wealth of the nation. On the second issue of how should we get the Rohingyas, what should happen in Myanmar? I think the answer is very simple. That these are the people. The Rohingyas are citizens of Myanmar, and they should be given citizenship. I think that is the starting point. That is the starting point of citizenship. Some of them have citizenship. They were all given citizenship, but when there was a decision to go after and to turn the Rohingyas into an enemy of the state, then all of this started changing. All of this citizenship rights began to change. I have a friend whose name is Shumong, and he's now away in Texas. He was a member of parliament. He was a member of parliament for the ruling party, by the way, of the ruling party in Myanmar. And when he went to file his candidacy for the second term, he was told that he's no longer a citizen. I mean, one day you're a citizen, on the other day you're not a citizen. How is this possible? So clearly something is wrong, and I think one of the things that ASEAN should do is to pressure Myanmar and the international bodies, including China in this matter, that the people of Rakhine should be given citizenship as a way forward, the first step forward towards for them to get back. I think also what needs to happen now is that there must be confidence building among the refugees who are now in Cox's Bazar, in the huge refugee camp. And I think if there could be an international police force or international or an ASEAN peacekeeping force in Rakhine State to protect them for a period of time, this will create confidence. And then the ability to move, the ability to go to schools, access to healthcare, and so on and so forth, could create confidence for the people of Rakhine, which is the Rohingyas, to go back. I think this is something that has to be done the way forward for people to go back to Rakhine State. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with Charles. I think that that's very important. I think, the ability for the Rohingya to believe that they're going to be able to return voluntarily, in safety, in dignity, with adequate protection so they don't go back into the hands of the Burmese military and police who abuse them so badly, and with full rights, including citizenship rights and rights to freedom of movement, rights to be able to select livelihoods and pursue livelihoods without restriction. These are the sort of things that the Rohingya are looking for. They're also looking to go back to their communities. They don't want to return to an internally displaced persons camp where they won't be able to work, where they won't be able to do anything. And they're essentially in a variation of the refugee camp that they're currently living in Bangladesh.
Can I also add on that, Hanung?
Please.
Well, actually, ASEAN don't have to duplicate the international process that already on Rohingya crisis. We already have the ICJ ruling and also a very comprehensive report of the international fact-finding missions in Myanmar, which lay out what is needed and also what are the aspiration of the Rohingya community itself inside Myanmar as well as outside the countries who are currently seeking refuge, which account more than 1 million people, by the way. So ASEAN's role should be very critical in ensuring that Myanmar are obliged with the recommendation that have provided by the ICJ ruling as well as that report. However, ASEAN created this duplication of process through the internal mechanism that we cannot really guarantee its independence with the Commission of Inquiry Myanmar as well as other task force within ASEAN. So given its unevident result would be really good that we can push the ASEAN leaders to abide with the what has been discussed in the international level. And then secondly, on the economic council, how to humanize it, I think definitely agree with Charles. We need to get back to basic, because the creation of ASEAN as a regional bloc is actually for the protection of human rights, for democracy. And although in the ASEAN Charter, the principle of ASEAN include non-interference, however, it also include protection of human rights, respect to democracy, and assuring access to fundamental freedoms. So I don't think we need to change any structure within ASEAN to humanize it, but we need to demand accountability of the government that might be mistakenly interpreting that for the interest of some group of people. And I have high hope with the ASEAN leaders and champions so that they can keep the economic principle of ASEAN for the interest of ASEAN people. And with that, I also would like to highlight the key role of Vietnam in ensuring participations of the people in reviewing the ASEAN human rights mechanism term of reference. Last year was the 10 years anniversary of the ASEAN human rights mechanism, and the ASEAN leaders agreed that last year they want to review the term of reference, but because of the pandemic, those processes have not been taken into places. So I want to remind them that this is the best time to actually reviewing the terms of reference, so that at least ASEAN can have a strong human rights mechanism that are able to accepting complaints and ensuring the human rights-based policy to address the pandemics. So thank you for that, Hanung.
Okay, thank you very much, Rachel. Since we already passed 20 minutes from the agreed time, I would like to humbly ask for the panelists to give each of you closing remarks, and then perhaps to try to answer on the last question: how should ASEAN solve and protect the human rights during COVID pandemics? Recommendations to the ASEAN leaders. I'm going to do it in the reverse order. So if Charles can go first to give the closing remarks.
Hold on. Okay, I think the pandemic offers a great opportunity for ASEAN, but not only the leaders of ASEAN, but also the people of ASEAN. It offers the people of ASEAN to reconstruct, rethink about the future of ASEAN, given the pandemic. Now, this pandemic might be with us for a very long time, till we find a vaccine. It could be with us for another year or year and a half. So I think, and it could even be longer, and we should be prepared. We should be prepared to have another pandemic after that. The way things are happening, we had SARS, and from SARS now we have COVID-19, and for all you know, we'll have COVID 2021. It might just go on. So that means we need to look at our society in a very different way. So one of the suggestions that we could put forward in ASEAN is to look at healthcare as national security, national protection, national security apparatus. Because whether you are rich or poor, you still have to go to a hospital. You still have to go to a hospital. So therefore, and that hospital must be a public hospital, because a public hospital has a mandate to respond to people, ordinary people. So this actually calls for greater investments in public hospitals across the board. Some of our hospitals, some of our countries have got very well developed hospitals, but they are private. They are private. But this pandemic actually tells us that the governments have to invest in public hospitals, and they should treat it as if it is like going to war, for example. It means we will have the best planes and the best bombs and so on and so forth. But so therefore, that's the kind of money that you have to invest in hospitals. So one of the things that we have to go back, we have to take carry with us, is that hospitals saves lives, health saves lives. So that means we have to invest in hospitals and medicines included, so that lives can be saved, not now, tomorrow, and the day after. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Phil?
Thank you very much for including me with this press conference. I really appreciate it. I would add that, too few people are talking about the issue of the vulnerable populations in these countries. And I would particularly like to emphasize that we need to be looking at what is being done for the migrant workers. We talk about a large number of people in countries like Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, also in Cambodia, also in parts of Vietnam. Other countries as well, where we're looking at these migrant workers who have been largely left out of the pandemic planning, are facing xenophobia. They don't have work, but they don't also have a social safety net or even a basic sort of community safety net to fall back on. They are, there's a lot of outpouring for nationals of the country who have lost their jobs, but what about the migrant workers? When you have foreign diplomats having to go out to give food to migrant workers because they are too afraid to go out and get it themselves, they can't afford to buy it, and they're afraid if they go out, they're going to get arrested by the police or face some sort of crackdown. This is the kind of thing that, these are a forgotten group, and this is unfortunate. I mean, the thing that ASEAN should be doing is it should be demanding that the governments, work together to come up with some common standards on how migrant workers are going to be protected. This is something that has been an issue at ASEAN all along. And the reality is that the divide within ASEAN between labor sending states and labor receiving states has been allowed to thwart policy for too long. And, these are people who in good times are helping build the economies of these countries. They shouldn't be forgotten because a pandemic strikes and people are starting to fend for themselves. So again, migrant workers, these vulnerable populations, refugees as well, let's not forget them.
Thank you, Phil. Lini, if you're still there.
Yeah, thank you so much Forum Asia and other CSOs who organized this ASEAN Community Virtual Summit and this press conference. My last comment will be that ASEAN leaders must learn from these pandemic situations and have to create social health care, social health protection that ensure all the people, the ASEAN people in the mechanism to achieve the real social protection. So the social protection should not leave the vulnerable group, poor people, indigenous group, migrant workers, refugees, LGBTIQ folks. They should be included and they should be protected. Thank you.
Thank you, Lini. And last but not least, Rachel.
Yes, thank you so much, Hanung. So I've shared the stark perceptions of ASEAN peoples on how they felt about ASEAN leaders. More than 80% of the ASEAN people perceive that ASEAN leaders have not effectively protect their rights during the pandemic. So I think it is very evident that this is the right moment for the ASEAN leaders to getting their act together to really promote and protect human rights with the current pandemic. And we cannot do anything for the ASEAN summit, which currently happening because none of the CSOs has been engaged in the process. However, we still have the next ASEAN summit, which will be happening in November or October. So we really hope that ASEAN leaders created a mechanism to engage CSOs in a meaningful way. And also we see that there is a leadership deficit within ASEAN right now with the transition of governments in Malaysia, as well as the Rohingya crisis that have not been addressed properly, as well as how we see the criminalizations is being increased in Indonesia. So really what we need from the ASEAN leaders are humility to looking at their core intentions to lead the countries and really having that ability to reflect on whether what they've done is wrong or right. And lastly, I also would like to highlight my recommendations to really put human rights at the center of the ASEAN post-pandemic recovery plan. It is very important in ensuring transparency and accountability of the plan. So with that, I would like to say thank you for all the media who have joined, and also to all the panelists and moderator for this media briefing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Rachel. So we are at the end of our media briefing today. But before that, there are questions that we might not be able to answer. So our technical teams will take notes on that and then give the panelists later to answer it by emails. And then we also encourage journalists also to reach the panelists directly to have further conversations on the area of their interest. And then if you don't have contact, you can also contact Forum Asia so that we can help you to arrange with the particular persons. And then last but not least, in order for us to get to facilitate better discussions for the next time, we're going to send evaluation forms for the participants. So please, if you can, oops, apparently there is a polling that I didn't know it's going to appear. So we're not going to send anything to you about the evaluation form, but please fill in the survey. And we're just going to share you the materials, the press release for today for your utilizations for further. So thank you so much for Rachel, Lini, Phil, and Charles for your time. And then the most two participants who have attended until this time. So let's keep continuing our struggle with ASEAN, because together I think we will be heard eventually by the leaders. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.